As I reread the beginning of Luke's gospel this past week, Mary's story washed over my soul, and my mind traveled back in time to the moment that I learned my son, Alec, would be entering this world. I wondered so much about him, what color his hair would be, what would his laugh sound like? Would he love the New Orleans Saints as much as I do? What type of career would he aspire to? Who would he fall in love with? I hoped that his world would be more equitable than the world in its current form. I prayed that he would work for justice and share mercy and walk humbly. And then, of course, amidst all of this wondering and hoping and worrying and praying, my spirit also leapt with gratitude. Somehow, despite all of my shortcomings and mistakes and missteps, regardless of all the times I took a sharp turn when I should have stayed on the path, for some reason totally beyond my understanding, I was being entrusted with a gift that I felt totally undeserving of. We find stories about Jesus' birth in two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Matthew's story revolves more around Joseph and his experience, whereas here in Luke's Gospel, Mary is the centerpiece. We'll hear the rest of Luke's Gospel on Christmas Eve. The details recounted by Matthew and Luke are quite different. I encourage you to read them and compare them, but both authors tip their hats towards the wondering and hoping and worrying and praying of soon-to-be parents. This extraordinary story is grounded in the ordinary. Now, of course, you don't have to be a parent or a soon-to-be parent to know that there is plenty to wonder and hope and worry and pray about in this world. You just have to be a human being with your eyes open. This past week, I flipped through a book on my shelf that I hadn't touched in ages, Both Flesh and Not, a collection of essays by David Foster Wallace. My favorite chapter highlights the championship match at Wimbledon in 2005. Roger Federer was on top of his tennis game at the time. He seemed on top of the world. He was preparing to claim his 8th Grand Slam title. David Foster Wallace describes Federer as being made of both flesh and not. Tennis Weekly surmised that Federer's particular abilities were 1 in 10 million. Federer approaches center court for the ceremonial coin toss, joined by William Keynes, a 7-year-old boy who had been diagnosed with liver cancer as a toddler. William had spent virtually his entire childhood undergoing chemotherapy. So here on the center court of Wimbledon, a superhuman child fighting a 1 in 10 million form of cancer stood next to his hero, a superhuman athlete with a 1 in 10 million ability to spin a tennis ball. Life is not always reasonable or explainable. It can seem random and full of chance. And I know in a way that's beyond knowing that Mary felt that weight. And yet, even here in this moment when life has thrown her a curveball, even in this moment when she has more questions than answers, she finds a way to trust at the deepest level of her being. Here I am, Mary says to Gabriel. Let it be. I was listening to a recent episode of the podcast On Being, during which Krista Tippett interviews our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, alongside Dr. Russell Moore, who is the president of Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Their conversation focused on how to bridge disagreement, and it's worth your time if you have a moment. But one of Presiding Bishop Curry's comments brought me right back here to this story about Mary. I struggle with this. It's not easy to do this, Presiding Bishop Curry begins. But how do I stand and kneel at the same time? Especially in my relationships with others, especially with those who disagree with me or I disagree with them, because I've got to kneel before them as someone created in the image of God, a child of God, just like me, loved by God equally. So I've got to kneel before them in a sense, and yet at the same time, I must stand with integrity. This might be news for some of us, though I hope it comes as a great relief. But none of us are God. We know that, right? The sun does not rise and set based upon any of us. You do not have to pretend to be God, and neither do I. And yet each of us carries God within us, and we have this great responsibility to honor God's presence within one another and to share God with one another. In our gospel story this morning, Mary shows us what deep trust looks like, but Luke also tells us that through Mary, God becomes human. And so, if we believe this to be true, that God did in fact become human, how then can we not honor the dignity of every other human being? I'll remind you that Emmanuel means God with us. The Gospel of Luke tells the story of God coming to be with us through a young, unmarried woman. She's powerless and pregnant, vulnerable in so many ways. Mary's not the expected messenger. She's an unlikely choice. And yet I'm also confident that her humility, vulnerability, and humanity helps Jesus grow into the type of person capable of both kneeling and standing. Some 2,000 years later, Mary is still challenging us to see God in one another. She wrestled with uncertainty, but found it within herself to trust. During her most vulnerable moment, she believed in the transformative power of hope. She didn't feel worthy, she said, and yet her spirit could not help but rejoice at the gift she had been given. Her life wove together the sacred and the common, the complicated and the simple, the extraordinary and the ordinary. Mary's story is a huge one. But as she wonders and hopes and worries and prays, her story is also a very human one. I know we're looking forward to Christmas and then, of course, to the beginning of a new year. Both will be here soon, I promise. But during these final glimmers of Advent, I hope you'll join me in looking towards Mary. She reminds us of what is possible when our hearts remain open. In the name of God, amen.